Jigs. What kind of jigs do I use? I like a marabou jig. Typically, when I'm jig fishing, I use a 10-pound line and an 1/8-ounce bait. Okay. If I'm going to be casting, which is what we do in the summertime and in the fall, I'll use a 6-pound on a 16-pound. So using a heavier line, a 10-pound, with an 1/8-ounce jig makes that 1/8-ounce jig fall like it's a 16. Bigger line cuts through the water, not as good as small line does. Okay, not as well as small line. So you can get by with using a heavier weight and a bigger line and make it fall a lot slower. Okay. So I team that up with an 1/8-ounce jig. I like the marabou jig. And the reason for that is that it has a lifelike look to it when it's wet. A lot of times, now remember, we're fishing cold water now. Okay, so cold water makes things stiff. So if you use rubbers and plastics, unless you have a super soft plastic or rubber, okay, it tends to mess with the action of the bait. Once this feather gets wet, it actually pulsates in the water. Okay, so it makes it look like this bait is alive when it's really not. It almost makes it look like it's breathing. Okay. A lot of times this time of the year, these fish are not very active. They're very lethargic. They're coming up out of that cold water. Okay, they're not very hungry, but they're willing to feed. A lot of times, just holding your bait dead still and let this bait actually work itself. If you're in a boat, you're not really keeping your bait as still as you think you are. You're trying to hold your bait still with your rod, but your boat's still moving. So no matter what, your bait is still down there doing some type of movement. But this marabou seems to help that. Okay, it seems to pulsate. I generally don't use minnows in the wintertime, in the springtime, because the fish are a little more aggressive. So what I do is I use a power bait. This came along here in the last 10 years, and it's got really popular with crappie fishermen. It's just a little, looks like a little marshmallow. If anybody's familiar with this, it's scent flavored, such as a shad. And you just put one on the hook, okay? One on the hook is just enough to give that just enough scent and make that fish think that we've got something real on it. Okay? When you put this on, the key to this is when you put it on, don't put it on the point of the hook. Put it around the bend of the hook and tuck it up against the body. Okay? Keep it as close to the body as you can. We want that fish to get hooked in that hook, and especially starting on the end of it. We don't want anything in the way of that. Okay? So don't put it just on the end of the hook and cover the point of the hook up. Okay? Now they make this in all kinds of colors. It's all pretty much the same flavor. I generally just use white because white blends in with just about all the jigs that I use. Another key to this stuff is that when you open this up, this stuff is very soft. And when you put it in the water, it gets softer and it doesn't last very long. What I'll do is 24 hours before I fish, I will lay this out on a piece of cardboard and let it dry out. And then it gets almost like the consistency of jerky. And it'll stay on the hook. You can catch multiple fish, maybe 2 or 3 fish off of one bait, then losing it every time something hits it. Okay? So keep that in mind. Dry this out a little bit, maybe about 24 hours before you use it, and stay on the bait or stay on your lure a lot longer. Okay, another trick to, since these fish are not hitting this thing with authority, it isn't like summertime fishing where the fish are just going to jerk the pole right out of your hand. A lot of times you do not know when these fish are even on this rock. Even by holding the line, a lot of times you don't know that these fish are on there. You jig it, nothing there. You feel something just a little bit heavy or mushy on there, okay? Almost like you've got a leaf or a twig or something. That's about the bite that you're going to get early in the spring season, okay? So what I normally do is I normally take these jigs and I will take the hook and I will pry it out a little bit so that when I lay this thing on my finger, when I pull up on this jig, it's gonna sink in my finger. Then I know that I got this hook opened up enough. A lot of times these hooks are curled down, okay, and they just skid along like this, okay. But if you open this hook up enough, which is about a 20-degree angle, okay, and you lay your finger here, it digs in, okay. That's about the consistency that you want that hook to be out. So that the harder you pull, the more that hook sinks in that fish's mouth, okay. Another thing is that when you catch a fish or when you get hung up, okay, you tie this line to the eye of this hook, and when you pull up on the fish or you pull up on a snag and you get it free or you catch that fish, this bait is actually hanging down like this, okay? Fish don't swim like this through the water or like this. Fish swim horizontal, perfectly horizontal. So a lot of times what I'll do when I catch a fish or I get hung up, I'll take the line and I'll hold the head of the jig and I'll pull it back towards the point of the hook. Now my jig sits nice and straight in the water. So this keeps you from getting hung up. Actually, your hook is higher than the head of the bait. So when you come up over something, it does not get hung up and drop back down in it and come back over the top of it. Keeps you from getting hung up a lot, keeping that hook higher. When this fish comes up behind this bait and he strikes it, the hook is the highest point on the bait. That's what's getting him hooked. If it's down like that, he's going to hit the head of it. Okay? Even if it's turned around like that, he's going to hit the head and never get the hook. So always pull, you take your line, hold the head, pull it down towards the point of the hook, and then your jig sits nice and straight or even a little bit higher than the water. Okay? Because we're going to be talking about fishing a brush pile. And anything that you can do to keep yourself from getting hung up all the time is going to catch more fish. Okay? Because when most people, when they get hung up in something like this, the first thing they do is start pulling on the rocks, pulling. But when you shake this thing, there goes all the fish. Okay? When you start rattling this thing around, you take a positive thing and turn it into a negative thing just like that. Okay? I believe that these fish know two things. They know positive and they know negative. And when you come into something and turn it into a negative right off the bat, you might as well just go off and leave it and come back to it later. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Now, like I said, these fish are going to make three transitions. They're going to come out of that deep water to the creek channel and get on the ledge. Then they're going to go to the standing timber, and then they're going to find these brush piles. Okay. Now, how am I going to approach this brush pile? I've been fishing this lake long enough where I know where there's a lot of brush piles. But if you watch your electronics, there's always log jams, there's always brush piles, there's always umps, there's always these things down there on the bottom that are irregular features. Okay. And if you watch your electronics when you're moving from spot to spot, a lot of times you can stumble onto these things. Okay. Let's just take, for instance, we're going to fish the standing timber first. Okay. Most of this standing timber is like a telephone pole. There's not a lot of limbs left on it. Okay. Because the ice, we normally get ice this time of the year, and so if the water level is fluctuating up and down, that ice, it just shears those limbs and stuff off of these trees and leaves more like a telephone pole. If you can happen to find something that has a limb that horizontally goes out away from the base of the tree, this is more of a plus for catching fish than not having it. Because the fish can only get around the tree. They can't get on something that reaches out from the tree. Okay? So these fish are going to stack up on some irregular feature on that tree. And normally that is a limb coming out to one side. Okay? Now, the other kinds of trees that we like to fish are multiple trees, where what sticks up out of the water is 3 or 4 things sticking up out of the water, not just one thing sticking up. If I was going to go into a cove or a creek, and I was going to start fishing and never knew anything about Mark Twain Lake, I would go back in there and I would pick out the things that are multiple. It doesn't have to be on the same tree. Maybe if there's 2 or 3 trees that are just growing close together, that gives more structure for the fish to be around than just something that's just a plain old telephone. So when you go back into these creeks and these coves, look for things that are multiple. Those are the things that are going to hold more fish than just single things. Okay? Right, he works with the bass too. I mean, creatures, you know, the fish are creatures of habit. And so, you know, if nobody catches those fish that have grew up in there year after year after year, you know, they're going to do the same thing. And I believe that when fish are born on the main lake, they're a main lake fish. When they're born back in the creek, they're a creek fish. Okay? And there's no change in their habit. That's just genetically put in. They're a main lake fish, they're a main lake fish. Okay? Because not all the fish pour out of the main lake and go all the way to the backs of the creeks and the rivers to spawn. I mean, there's different levels of the spawn. Not all fish do the same thing at the same time. So there's different parts of the lake that warm up quicker than other parts. There's different parts that stay colder longer. Okay? So you have this progression a lot of times of these fish spawning, which makes that spawn season longer. It makes it about a month to a month and a couple of weeks longer. Because I'm down here and I'm fishing these areas that are warming up quicker. Well, these fish up the lake have not even thought about spawning yet. So I'm progressively watching these fish in this spawning mode move up and down the lake. Okay? Wind direction dictates a lot of what these fish do and when they do it. And, you know, north winds. North winds are not warming winds, so it backs the fish off generally. Okay? South winds and west winds are winds that are warm. Okay? It's going to push the fish to the bank. It's going to warm those areas up quicker. Those waves and the wind that's hitting that north bank out of the south, it's warming that north bank up. So these fish are going to go in there and they're going to spawn in those areas first. Okay? So typically when I'm looking for these fish, I'm on the north and east banks of this lake. Okay? Generally this lake runs east and west. The main body of this lake runs east and west. So north and south winds, okay, dictate how quickly or how slowly things warm up and cool down. What I'm going to typically do is during this time of the year, I'm going to pick on the north bank. I'm always going to go to the north and east banks because the north wind comes over the top of them, but a south wind comes into them. And the arc of the sun also dictates, you know, what banks we're going to spawn on. Because, you know, our sun rises in the east, sets in the west. Well, a north bank is going to get sun all day long. Okay? So we're taking an 18,000-acre lake and we're putting you in 15 foot of water or less, and we're putting you on the north and east banks of the lake. So we've already took 18,000 acres and we've cut it already in half.